This story is one that's been a kind of unfolding puzzle. It's one that's been published by one story collector or another over the years, usually with the title The Beaver Wife. And it's about a boy that marries a beaver, but that's not the point. When John Blackned told it to me, he said that it was called The Boy Who Was Not Born Naturally. And that is the point. It took me a long time to just get that far. And then, not too many years ago, I told this story to a group of storytellers. And one of the people in the back row said, "From the first sentence of that story, I felt like I was going into a Shakespearean tragedy." Now, that had never occurred to me before, but I thought about it. I'm going to give you some of the results of it. On the surface, it's almost silly. It's a story about a young boy who decides, for reasons we don't need to go into, that he's not going to have a wife from human beings. He's going to have a wife from animals. And his older brother advises him strongly, you could say, against that, but he persists. And he goes through a series of girlfriends. And this is all kind of comical, you know. He tries a beaver wife, but he decides that she's not quite good enough looking for him. And he tries a caribou woman, but he notices that when she gets up to relieve herself, she stands up hind end first, and he figures that his friends will be poorly impressed with her modesty. And he tries a porcupine, and he tries a Canada Grey Jay, Whiskey Jack, although it's a very small wife. And so he recounts these stories, and eventually he comes back to the beaver girl, and he begs her, and she says, "Okay, but you're going to have to come and live with me in the water." And he thought he would drown, but he followed instructions and threw his mitt to her, and she dove under and threw it back to him. It was dry. So he started living like beavers. And being a fairly officious young fella, he said, "Well, if I'm going to live like beavers, there are going to have to be some changes made. We're going to have to start making these houses stronger so that the human hunters can't break them in so easily and get us and kill us. And we're also going to have emergency exits so that when they're guarding the door, we can slip out another door." And this leads to complaints by the humans in the area to this fellow's older brother, who gets angry. And the older brother finds his younger brother and said, "You can see that life is going to be a lot harder if you continue to have this woman for your wife." But he persists. And finally, there's a pursuit where the younger brother outruns the older brother and goes out into James Bay, where he lives and grows big into a giant beaver. The story ends there. Well, doesn't sound like a particularly distinguished story. It sounds like a story about a marriage, a poor choice of marriage. It's much more than that. I'll come back to that in a minute. I want to come first to how I got the story in the first place. A young fellow that started working for us in the first summer of 1963, worked translating and sort of managing our affairs so that we didn't interrupt anything, we didn't hurt anybody's feelings, we didn't commit any social sins, visit anybody when it wasn't welcome, and so on. And he and I got kind of close. And I thought of him as a friend, and he thought of me as a friend. And so the second summer we had great plans. We were going to go inland to the village of Namaska on the Hudson's Bay Plain because there weren't regular flights in there. But the Hudson's Bay would take freight in a single engine plane. And for not very much money, you could go in and you could come out free because the plane had to come out and it was empty. But before that could happen, Willie got sick. And he was kind of scared. He thought that somebody was conjuring him. And then Willie died. And I took that pretty hard. I holed up in the little cabin that I'd rented. And I didn't go out for a few days. And old John Blacknad took an initiative, which he never did on any other occasion. He found a young fella to translate, and he came to see me there. And this is the story he told me. Now, he told me that story because he thought I would find it interesting and I could have a laugh at a younger brother who wanted to marry a whiskey jack or a caribou or a beaver. And so let's get back to the fellow that thought he was entering a Shakespeare tragedy. In the end of this story, the younger brother has been living with beavers and eating with beavers and basically being a beaver, and he has himself taken on the appearance of a beaver. Maybe not exactly, but pretty much so, but he's big. And he doesn't come across as being noble. When he thinks that he and his wife are trapped by his older brother, he tells his wife, "You go out first," sort of testing to see what happens. And of course, she gets an axe in the head and she's dead. And then the older brother breaks in the beaver house and tells him, "I told you life was going to be hard if you tried to have a wife from beavers. Now come out," he said. And he announced that he was going to have a feast. Everybody was invited. And the younger brother was invited. And the younger brother said something somewhat magical. It goes back to something earlier in the story, and I won't bother with that. I'll just say that it was magical. It involved a statement of power. "I can only eat the meat of a male beaver, not of a female beaver. If the meat of a female beaver should touch my lips, you'll see what will happen." And the older brother wasn't particularly impressed with this. Of course, he had had the beaver wife cooked, a female beaver. And when everybody was gathered, everybody was given a little bit of this beaver. And when the younger brother touched it to his lips, suddenly, in the middle of a winter, all of the rivers broke up. The ice on the rivers broke up. Great thunderous noise, and the ice was tumbling down river and causing flooding and damage and so on. The moment it happened, the younger brother had jumped up and run out of the teepee where the feast was, heading for the water, one of the rivers. And his older brother grabbed his spear and went after him. Well, the younger brother got to the river and he swam. The older brother chased him, but he never did catch up to him. And as he came to the coast, he could see his younger brother already out in the bay some distance. And so, with all the power that he could muster, he picked up a huge rock and threw it at his younger brother, hoping to hit him with it, pin him down, drown him. But it missed. The younger brother swam out, and he grew and he grew and he grew until he became what they call the Great Beaver. Well, it's a story about a marriage, but it's a story about more than that. Where did that younger brother wind up? By himself? In the water. Out in James Bay. Couldn't risk coming into a river. No company. He was completely isolated. He was lost. What had he lost? He had lost friends, family, species, everything. And at the close of one of Shakespeare's plays, Shakespeare says, "And the rest is silence." Sure enough it was. Well, that makes it really a play about a person who loses his human nature. Just being lost is a terrible thing. People don't know where you are. They don't know what your condition is. They don't know if you've gone berserk and you've become a Wheatico. They don't know if you're suffering, waiting for them to find you. It's a terrible thing to be lost. Well, this boy was more than lost. He was alive. He was able to eat. He didn't freeze. He had warm fur. But he was completely solitary in this world. So that's really the ultimate tragedy. The rest for him was silence. I don't know why John picked that story. Maybe he thought that the funny part would cheer me up, because I was pretty depressed at the time. Or maybe he thought that I'd see past that to see that the funny part really was just to relax you so that it could make a less funny point about what happens when you try to marry something from another species. Or maybe, just maybe, it was to make a very profound point. What is the worst thing that can happen to a person? It's to become totally and irrevocably lost. So there you are.